Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the April 2024 edition of EPIC Insight. This is Joe Corona. I'm the Director of Sales and Strategic Partnerships at EPIC Retirement Plan Services, and I'll be the host for today's call. Prospecting for new clients is at the heart of every growing and prospering practice. How you find and market to new prospective clients is critical for sustained growth. Navigating the modern ways of prospecting is important in our ever-evolving marketplace. And to help us lead us through that are our partners at Janus Henderson. The Janus Henderson Modern Prospecting Program will lead us through the process of expanding prospecting techniques to attract new clients that we want and learn how to master the art of modern prospecting in the new normal and beyond. To help introduce our speaker today is Carissa Baker from Janus Henderson. An industry veteran of 20 years, Carissa is a Senior Account Manager of Retirement with Janus Henderson and is headquartered in Denver, Colorado. Your line will be muted throughout the call, but if you have any questions that you'd like addressed, we ask that you enter them in the webinar control panel, and we will address them at the end of the session. With that, I will turn it over to Carissa.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you for having us today. We really appreciate the partnership with EPIC. I'm very excited to introduce everyone to Bryan Powell. He's a Senior Director and leads our practice management team here at Janus Henderson. The goal of this team is to work with financial professionals to help them achieve business success. Before starting at Janus Henderson, Bryan was a practice management consultant and leadership coach at Fidelity, Wells Fargo, and Merrill Lynch. And I have to say he's quite the coaching guru, with more professional credentials behind his name than we have time to discuss in this webinar. But more than anything, I think you'll find his good energy is very contagious. And so with that, I will turn it over to Bryan to have us walk through modern prospecting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Carissa. Thank you, Joe. Oh, it's awesome to be here. My first time presenting here at EPIC, as Carissa was mentioning. So I have the honor and privilege of coaching advisory teams and leadership teams across the nation, whether it's in a wirehouse, independent, RIAs, retirement consultants. So it's a pleasure to be here. I have a coach and credential last 10, 11 years. And so, we can geek out together all day long. One thing you'll find about me, I don't believe there are magic words that'll come out of my mouth that you can go out and get a referral. I feel it's your personality. It's what we need to pull out of you, what you feel comfortable with. So today, what I'm going to share with you is actually, I'm really grounded in research. So I'm going to go through some research that we did. So with the FPA Association partnership with Janus, we actually reached out to advisors. We really asked them, like, hey, what are some of the things that you're really strong at when you think about putting down growth and doing that consistently? What are some of the obstacles that are getting in the way as well? So I'm going to share that with you in the beginning. And these are all advisors, 500 million and up in AUM. So they're already successful. They've already been in their career for quite a bit. So we've got a lot of insight from them. In addition, what I'm going to share with you is all the different things that I've worked on when I'm working with different teams. So usually I'm working with teams anywhere from like 5 to 10 team members up to 50, 60 team members, depending on that organization. And so taking some of the best practices that we've designed and we've put in place. So I'm going to give you some things in some different areas and put that together. So hopefully it sparks some intrigue, sparks some curiosity. The one thing I've found about financial professionals in our industry, and you'll see that in the research, sometimes it's what you need to do, it's just you're not acting on it. So what's getting in the way? What are the obstacles? What are the blocks there? So I will pull up my presentation, the deck that I'm going to walk through. I think we've got 30 minutes, so I'm going to condense it. Usually this is about an hour, hour and a half, but what I will say is in our partnership, if anybody's intrigued and wants to spend some additional time together just to kind of go through some finer points, you'll have my contact info, you have Carissa's contact info, Joe as well. So feel free to reach out and we can establish some time in between my travels to really sit down and go through this in more thorough as well in a one-on-one or a group setting. So let me go ahead. I'm going to share the deck that I prepared for the team today. Let me bring that up here real quick. So what I was talking about previously is that we're going to look at it from that lens of growth. So this is going to be more about the research base, what comes into that with your peers. In addition, we're going to look at some best practices that we built out with teams. Some things are going to be unique, some things are going to be different. Some things you might have seen before, but with a different twist on it as well. So as we jump into it, one thing I wanted to show you is our partnership. The reason I came to Janus Henderson is we're actually creating things for the financial profession that come from financial professionals. So as you can see here, We have all sorts of different consultants that we can really assist and really support through a different lens. One, I always like to tell the story. You'll see wealth strategists there. So I've got a big team, a couple billion in AUM. They're actually working on centers of influence and referral strategies. Well, we actually have a wealth strategist who used to be a practicing attorney. So he can come in and we both actually do the sessions together. So you've got the coach and you have the center of influence that used to be there. So what a better way to start to map out a strategy that would really be different and unique than the other financial professionals that are reaching out to them as well. So as we start to jump in, here's the agenda that I always put together. I really want to ground that in the research once again. So we're going to go over the findings that we had. So I'm going to look at the study that we did, along with, once again, those advisors, 500 million and up in AUM, and what they gave to us and really talked about. In addition, we're going to look at some 3 steps that we have here as well. So I talk about 3 steps. We're going to talk about things like clarity, focus, and action. So try to keep it simple as we start to put this plan together and really make it actionable. So as we jump in, then we'll have some next steps and some tools that we can share with you afterwards as well. So first step, we talked about this. So this is a study that we did last year. And once again, I'm just a coaching geek. So as I get to work with all these teams, these advisors, these retirement consultants, we start to talk about the research and ground that in. So what you can find here is we start asking all these different financial professionals, talking about like, hey, are you motivated when it comes to growth? And so what we saw was 71% were actually comfortable with their current growth rate. So that means 29% are not. The thing that really got me to geek out is only 12% would strongly agree with that statement. And I can tell you, working with different advisory teams and working with different retirement consultant organizations, we start to see that really there's some obstacles there, or we're not consistent, or we don't have a plan. So what we're going to look at as we start to go through some of this research, we're going to look at how that really talked about those fastest growing advisors and what they're doing differently. There's 6 areas that they brought into it, and I'm going to show you those. One of those being a business plan matters. So I can't tell you how much time I spend when I'm working with teams on actually crafting their business plan. Some might have a sort of skeleton to it, but do you actually have leading and lagging KPIs? Do you know exactly how to quantify where you're spending your time, so that if you're not being successful, then you can pivot? And that's a big thing that we saw. And also systems and process. So as you start to think about this, we can also help in putting that together. I do that simply with advisors too, and retirement consultants, so they can quantify their time. Now it becomes more simplified. They're either winning, they're not winning. If they're not winning, that's where a coach can come in and say, there's no judgment there. What can we do differently? What are the things that are pulling you back? That could be communication. That could be, I sound too salesy. Things like that come into it, so we can really support and help you there as well. So as we start to jump in, here's a screen that I always get curious about with different individuals when I go through this presentation. So what we found is 64% of those that were in this research said, yes, Bryan, a clear plan to drive growth is essential to my business. I need to have that. We do some things in January or in December to set out goals for that next year coming forward. It has to be a clear plan. It has to be actionable. So that means 36% don't even engage in that. The other flip side of that is only 30% said they have a clear plan to grow their business. So 64% say having a clear plan in place is absolutely essential. Only 30% are doing it. So without judgment, we start to get curious about it. So a couple things that came up. You can see that I have them here on the screen. So some of your peers, it's that mindset. I'm appearing like I don't have that authentic way to actually engage with my prospects or with my clients to talk about introductions, referrals, account consolidations, things like that come in. So helping them to find their natural language and what would make them feel comfortable and confident. In addition, I'll talk about some stats when it comes to centers of influence. 61% said they need to actually spend time in the space and cultivate those relationships. I was just recently asked to be on a panel for UBS, one of their big regional events. And what we did, what was fascinating, is we actually had 2 CPAs, 2 investment bankers, and then we also had 2 estate planning attorneys. So they came in and we started really getting curious with them with a big audience. And the one thing that came up was, Bryan, I'm tired of these financial professionals calling me, just asking me for coffee or lunch so they can ask me for introductions. So things have to be done differently. So I'm going to share some techniques and things that we've done with teams to change that mindset to be a differentiator, because the large accounts come from those centers of influence. I'm going to share some research that comes along with that as well. And then really thinking about it, I said in the beginning, I'm not somebody who believes that I can give you magic words that you're going to go implement and all of a sudden you're going to get referrals and they're going to come through, or introductions. What we need to craft is, how do you hold yourself accountable to find your language? your personality style, and then find those moments that you're going to hold yourself accountable to ask as well. So those are things that came out from the research and things that it really started to correlate. I would say in my work, that 30% that have a clear plan to grow my business, I would actually put that a little bit lower. So that was a little bit higher from my perspective, just with all the teams that I engage and work with. That's a lot of the work that we do, is really helping them craft that out. So that came from all the peers out in the industry. Here's another thing that really hit me and I got curious about as well. So when we start thinking about this, what do they actually track if they do have their business goals? Something that really stuck out to me, only 26% actually gauge if they're actually getting better and more effective when they engage new clients or prospects. To me, that spoke to, well, how do I know if I'm actually need to have an opportunity to increase my language, my confidence, the moments that I ask? So all those things that come to it. And another thing that really came out as well, we might be tracking new assets. That's usually the norm. But when we start thinking about it, the client satisfaction and the number of prospects in the sales funnel, that's something where here at Janus actually created we'll call it a modern prospecting monthly agenda. So teams can get together and show up, once again, with no judgment, not a me versus you where it gets competitive, but more of who do we have? How can we help close that business? What's that next step in the process? And making sure that we have that. And as you can see, when we start looking at the leading and lagging indicators, 84% of the fastest growing firms have that clear plan. So do you have that clear plan? Or are you measuring things consistently so that you can get curious with yourself and your team? And what are the things that you can improve upon? When I started this and I started thinking about this new client prospect ratio, that takes me back to the days when I first started back in the 90s, where my sales manager said, hey, Brian, make 100 calls and one person's going to say yes. And even back then, I was like, there has to be a better way. And that's what this speaks to. So this is to give you what your peers are struggling with a bit as well, is what do I measure? What are the things that are going to lead to my success? So we'll send this out, and I would challenge everybody to take a snapshot and make sure, hey, what can we do to be more consistent here? How can we support each other when it comes to our growth? And then also, how can we become more effective and efficient in these spaces? So that's another bit of interest that comes into this. Here's one that I really got curious about. So we started talking about systems and process. And this really came in when we started to really think about these advisors. And one of the glaring things that came out, you can see over here, when we think about the number of new clients added, so less than 5 is the orange, 5 to 9 the blue, 10 plus over in the gray. If you have a process, a formal or an informal process, that actually turned out to be the same when it came to 10 plus households, 10 new accounts that came in. That surprised me. I thought it had to be a formal process. I'm biased because being a coach and consultant to help that build out. But even if you had an informal process, so you're just talking about it actively, weekly, you're mentioning it, you're supporting each other in that, you still see the growth that comes in there. Without a process in place, here's where we're at. And once again, this is objective information coming from peers out in the industry where, they're already been successful in their business. But if we don't have a clear plan to growth, this is usually what happens when we're thinking about the amount of households that we can come in. And you can see across the board, we're lower in these other areas as well. Whereas we do have a formal process, we're still being more successful when it comes to this 5 to 9 and less than 5 also. So once again, that's something that's coming from financial professionals for financial professionals. So I would challenge you to take a look at that. And if you don't have a system and process in place, once again, we've got tools. I'm not big on just talking and having a theory behind it. We have some tools that we built just to help these teams to really think about how they already take their success and just elevate it. And so really making sure that we're conscious about that as well. So here's what came out of it. So when we think about focusing on growth, this came from the study. So there's 6 different areas that came in. I already talked about how a business plan matters, right? That's something that's almost essential when I'm talking with teams. Oh yes, Brian, I have a business plan. I just showed you the research behind it, that it's not effective in most cases. Or they might say they have one, but then only the 30% I'll refer back actually do, right? So start thinking about that does matter. Here's a big one I can tell you. In my decade of working as a consultant and a coach, you know what to do, but they don't always act. So there's something there, and that's what fascinates me about being a coach. Like, what are the obstacles that are occurring? You know you need to spend time in business development, but it's not happening. Well, Brian, I'm busy all the time. Well, that's where we help you prioritize your rocks. What are the things that you need to be doing on a consistent basis? How can we quantify that? How can we pull it out of you? And those are some of the things that come into this as well. So acting on what you already know you need to be doing, And I could point back to that research where we even talk about asking for referrals. You know, that's where a big portion of your growth is going to come from, but for some reason we're not doing it. How do we help you engage, and how do we help you figure that out? Teams grow faster than firms without. That was another big one that came in. Systems and process, I already talked about that as well. Here's a big one too. Every single financial professional I've worked with, I can say, hey, do you have an ideal client, an ideal client that you've identified? Most all of everybody says, yes, I do, right? That's kind of like day one stuff. When you come in, you start to build that out. Although when I look at their book of business, maybe only 5–10% actually meet that criteria. So what's happening where we've actually identified who our ideal prospect or client is, but then we're all of a sudden collecting all these other accounts, like getting curious once again, what's happening there, and how do you actively engage those that you really want to bring into your business? And then the last piece that we had here too is we started talking about mindset. So mindset can be so powerful when we start to really think about it, and that came out from this study as well. So I'm going to share a few things from you here also and give you some resources. So if you're interested to really help shift, if that's an area that you really want to accelerate as well. So that takes to the first point. So I always start out with mindset. Sometimes I get, Brian, well, that's sort of the fluffy stuff. That's more of the qualitative stuff. I would challenge the fluffy and say it is qualitative, but it leads to your results. So we already saw it in the study where we talked about people feeling salesy, or, hey, I know what I need to do, I'm just not acting on it. This comes from Carol Dweck. So if you haven't read the book, Mindset is a fantastic book to read where you think about, and you might have seen this before, your thoughts become your emotions, your actions, your outcomes. So as you start to think about things that can support you when it comes to a mindset, Carol's actually awesome. She's actually a psychology professor at Stanford University. Had the chance to spend a couple of days with her and actually go through her material. So when you start to think about sitting down, when you are prospecting, I always challenge the financial professionals I work with, what's your 15-minute routine before you're going to jump on that phone or you're going to end up in that personal one-on-one meeting at face-to-face? You need to get your mindset correct because you've got all these things going on in your head. So that conversation can come off in transactional, which is not meant to be. It's not the intention. But because you have all these things going on, you need to really take that time to prepare. And it doesn't need to be complex. 10–15 minutes, have your 3 or 4 questions that you can align, have a few of these visuals that you can really look at so that once again, you can be fully engaged when you either reach out over the phone, when you're meeting face-to-face, all those things that come in along with the discovery meeting as well. So you minimize the distractions. And here's where you might have heard this before, but we can talk about fixed mindset versus growth mindset. And I always give a story here. One of the great advisors that I've had the pleasure to work with years ago was at Merrill Lynch. Probably produced a little $2.5 million by himself and was on a large team, led a large team. So awesome, fantastic individual. One of those people that you're just so engaged with every time you talk to them. I had to tell him, I said, Tom, you must get so many referrals because you're so engaging in all the things that happen. And he looked at me and said, Brian, I don't ask for referrals. Well, Tom, wouldn't that impact other lives? Don't you feel like what you do adds value and impact to all these families that you get in contact with? Absolutely. But 10 years ago, I had this one instance where I asked a referral from a client and they went off on me. They told me, don't you ever impede on our relationship. Don't ever try to ask me for an introduction or referral again. Don't ever really approach that in our conversations. Go back to mindset. That was 10 years of this very successful advisor. And the only thing I was asking him is like all the families and all those individuals, companies that you could have impacted in such a positive way because you're so good at what you do. So we had to help him craft that. Hey, if you ask for an introduction and you fail, what did we learn from it? What are the things that we could do differently? Because if you don't have success, our brains work neurologically, and I can geek out about this all day, right back to what's comfortable. How do we make sure we don't allow that to happen? And once again, these are coming stories for working with these different successful individuals, helping them overcome that. So it's not just the newer folks that come into our industry, it's happening with industry veterans all the time. It's a matter of setting up a space and having these types of discussions that once again came from the research from your peers. So that starts with mindset. I'm going to go through this because like I said, we only have about 15–20 minutes left together, but here's the 3 areas that we've designed for you. Once again, this comes from the work of working with all these different organizations. So clarity, number 1, I'm going to walk you through that. We're going to talk about not only ideal prospect, once again, everybody's done that work, but how do we get curious about what's in our book of business, who we're attracting, who we're speaking to. So I put a little spin on it, a little flip on it, just to make sure that you can get curious with each other. We're talking about focus. There's actually 5 areas of focus that I put in here. I always challenge teams, pick 2 or 3. 2 or 3, let's start to build out that strategic business plan that we talked about before. Once we do that, we start to get really good at it, gets ingrained in our DNA, then we can pick another one off the shelf, and then we'll talk about action as well. So I'll probably have time just to go through 1 or 2 in the focus area. But once again, we'll send you all this information, and if we want to check in afterwards, we can absolutely help out with that as well. So our first one, clarity. You're gonna see I'm very simple when we come to those instructions. So we're gonna identify, analyze, and define. And when we talk about clarity, what we're really trying to drive towards is getting curious about your book. Now, I have top 30 clients in here. I told you I work with a lot of bigger teams. So you can change this to 5, you can change this to 10, you can change this to 15, whatever you like. But the whole idea here is, you know who your ideal client is. If you don't, you can absolutely do some work there. But we go back in and we look at your book of business. We start to look at those prospects that you're bringing in as clients. And now we start to identify, like, who are those top clients that we love to work with? And it's not just about size of the accounts. It's not just about AUM and revenue and thinking about the household size. It's also thinking about, like, hey, are we getting introductions from them? Do we enjoy talking to them? Things that you've heard from others that have come in and speak about as well. But do you actually analyze what that ideal client looks like and who you have in your book of business? I share a story. There's a team I'm working with now. They're about 2.4 billion in assets, 15 team members. And the thing that really resonated was when I asked them, like, how many households do you have? It was 535. And usually if we're going through this and I have time, I'll ask the audience, how many do you think actually fit their ideal profile? Usually I'll get numbers that come back, 150. It's actually 34. So once again, such a successful business, but really thinking about now we're in this busyness mode because we're not attracting the people that we've identified as our ideal client. So what we do here is we actually map that out. So we define those qualitative and quantitative attributes, have that all here as well just to get you started. So once again, the quantitative is usually where I see financial professionals are really good at, really strong at. The qualitative is where we come in. We combine the two together. Now we start to look at our top clients, what the meaningful things are. And now, if I've got a book of business of 530 of them meet my ideal profile, but then the other 470 don't for some reason, that's when we can start to have the conversation. Where are you spending your time? What meetings are you having where we're not bringing in, once again, the people that we really want to attract, not just because of the AUM and the production side, but because we know that those are the people we can help. We know that we can do estate planning. We know we can do retirement consulting for them. We know we can have all these other things that we can support them with, but we're not really attracting them. So once again, there's no judgment there. It's to get clarity. It's to get focused together as a team and really start to think about, where do we need to shift? Is it our language? Is it where we're spending our time? Is there other things that we need to do to hold each other accountable in a positive way? And so that's the first part. So a little twist on it. Every time I say I work with financial professionals, I almost take an assumption that you have your ideal client built out, but what's happening where you have your ideal client and it's not matching what you have in your book of business or in your pipeline? So things to really get curious about with you and your team, and even some of your managers, to really start to think about, like, hey, what could I be doing differently to make that shift? So there's the recap. So we identify, we talk about your ideal prospect, you've got them in your book. We talk about analyzing, what are those attributes that you assign to it? And then what do you want to design? What do you want to commit to in the future? We actually have a tool that we call the affinity audit. You'll see that on here. So that you can get with your team, you can start to map out your energy when you're talking to these clients, all these quantitative and qualitative. And then once again, start to get curious. What needs to change? What needs to shift? Or I've only met 1 or 2 advisors where I would say 80–85% of their book actually matches their ideal client, but they did a lot of work. There's a lot of things that they really needed to really get insight into their own style and approach. So that's our first step there, really thinking about it. It's a little twist on what you've done before, probably, when thinking about building out your ideal client. So now I'm going to go through focus. So we're going to talk about define, strategize, and commit. So we talked about only 30% of advisors that we had in that survey and that research with the FPA and ourselves declared that, yes, I have a clear plan to grow my business. We saw only 12% said, like, I strongly agree that I'm on track, where I'm going to really commit to and how I'm going to do this and how I'm going to make sure I hit those goals. So we start to think about it. Here's the roadmap. So these are the 5 areas that I work most with, and this is where it was created from. And we're starting to think about, like, how we're going to live into our growth goals, the things that we want to accomplish, the things that really give us energy. So when we look out 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, we know that we're going to be on that growth trajectory and not get stagnant. And I've seen a lot of teams and a lot of advisors get stagnant, or for a couple of years, we're just not seeing that growth. Once again, getting curious about what's happening there. So I'll go over a couple here, but here's the roadmap, and you can print this out if it would be valuable and impactful to you. You can print it out and have as a one-pager. That's exactly why it was built this way. You can see it has the 3 steps in each one as you start to think about it. So I'm probably gonna talk about centers of influence, and we'll get into digital presence as well a little bit, but you can see that we've got other things to think about when it comes to investor education, networking events, referral process. We're just not gonna have the time to go through it all today, but once again, we can make some time in the future if it would be valuable to you. So centers of influence, this is my favorite one. I'm probably working this with all these different advisors and all these different retirement consultant teams that we come and act. Recently, I was at a regional event for UBS, and what we did, I was mentioning this before, we actually had centers of influence come in. So we had 2 CPAs, we had 2 investment bankers, and we had 2 estate planning attorneys. And we started asking them questions and say like, hey, what really grows your relationship with a financial professional? Where you look that they're gonna help your business and you're gonna help their business, we're gonna see referrals and introductions. It was so, I already knew the answer was gonna come out, but it was so engaging to see what actually said. It actually came back and said, Bryan, we're tired of taking these calls because people just wanna invite us to a coffee or invite us to a lunch, and all they wanna talk about is how they can get business from us. So here's where I wanna make that challenge and where I've helped advisors change that mindset. So number 1, think about being a giver versus a taker. Are you a taker where you show up as a center of influence and that's your conversation? You're talking about how we can do business together, who their ideal client is, and how you can refer over. Or do you show up as a giver? Adam Grant has some great research on this. There's actually a book called Give versus Take. So when you start thinking about that, he's a well-known psychologist. You show up as a giver, and I'm gonna give you some techniques when we start talking about that. So when I'm coaching a team or financial professional, instead of us just inviting a center of influence for coffee and start talking about referrals and introductions, we're talking about things that we can do to support their business. So one of the things that we'll talk about, CPAs. I have a lot of teams where those CPAs that they're engaged with have newsletters. If they're a successful CPA, that newsletter probably reaches 2,000 to 3,000 people. I think 3,000, 4,000 have been the max when we've actually designed this and actually seen success from it. But when you have that newsletter, you as a financial professional, retirement consultant, advisor, you actually have this thought leadership that you can contribute to their newsletters. How do you show up and say how we want to support you? And I can support you and your clients by actually writing some pieces that actually would be valuable so you can include. And once again, now we're helping you educate your client base. We're helping them be more engaged in your business and your practice. We are top of the line, we're top of mind because the other 15 individuals that are coming to them asking for, once again, just the introductions as takers are not thinking in that way. Another thing that we've done when we come to centers of influence, what are the topics that we can do to support your clients and hold an event? Have a virtual event that we're doing here recently that's going to be coming up with a large team. We're actually inviting the centers of influence, a CPA and estate planning attorney. We're just inviting their clients to a virtual webinar. We're going to talk about managing your stress for success. Nothing to do about financials. It has to do about their clients, what they're dealing with. What are some of the top topics? If you're interested, you can send me a note, send me an email. I've got a list of CPAs and then also thinking about estate attorneys, what their 10 topics of interest are for their clients. So now you can go to that meeting and start talking about what are the 2 or 3 things that are really showing up as issues or things that we can help and support you. So once again, coming in, being open and being vulnerable, allowing yourself to say, how can we support you? It's a different mindset, a different conversation that other advisors and financial professionals are having with these centers of influence. So there's a whole bunch of different things you can do if you shift that mindset and don't show up as that taker, you show up as that giver. The last one I'll give you in centers of influence too. Oh my gosh, when you start thinking about some of these centers of influence that they actually knock it out of the park when it comes to their service that they provide to their clientele. Have you ever reached out to them and say, I'm trying to get better with the client service that we provide. What are some tips that you would be able to give to me? Can you come in and I show you our process and what we do so we can make it real, we can make it tangible, and then also get your input on what we could do better. Humility, vulnerability, which builds trust. So now you're bringing them in as being owners in your business, being partners in your business, rather than, once again, just showing up, asking for introductions and referrals. So that's our first one there, centers of influence. So I'm going to make sure that we stay on track here. I think we've got, I'll try to wrap it up in about 5 minutes. So centers of influence, we have it all designed here for you, making sure that we've got it where we reach out proactively. I gave you 3 different tactical things that you can show up differently with a center of influence and talk to them about. So really take that into consideration the next time you're preparing your mindset to have these conversations, because I can tell you when it comes to centers of influence, research shows that's where your largest accounts are going to come from. I think one study I saw was 89% of the households 10 million and over that come from families are actually referred through their estate planning attorney or their CPA. So building these relationships is essential if you want to have those larger accounts that you attract. Going back to what we talked about before with the affinity audit, what's happening that's not matching our ideal client profile. So let's go one more. Got 5 minutes here. So digital presence. This is one that, oh my gosh, over the past decade I've been working on when we start thinking about it with advisors, financial professionals. What I like to say is, what is your unique voice? How do you share your unique voice? So how do you present yourself as an expert in the field? So showcasing the experience and knowledge of your team, so that becomes an advantage. So whether it's on LinkedIn, I can send you a bunch of LinkedIn stats that we really commit to as well, or we start to think about your website or how you actually display yourself on social media. It makes all the difference. Your prospects, your clients, they're Googling you. They're going forward, and the first thing that usually comes up is your LinkedIn profile. So making sure that you define what you want your team's digital presence to be. I always geek out about Simon Sinek, so we start talking about the why. What's the why? How do you pull that out? What are your top 5 values of your team? And how do you actually define those so that it creates an emotional connection when you start to think through it as well? So what we do with teams, we start to think about, once again, here's the different areas. And I can tell you, the most recent one I read, there was an article published by the American Marketing Association, and they talked about that organizations that have a clear marketing plan and strategy, 60% faster when it comes to growth than those that don't have a strategy. It goes back to our business plan, right? I can give you some LinkedIn stats. We're talking about 70% of would-be buyers say LinkedIn is the most trusted source of information. And also, we talk about audience exposed to brand and acquisition messages on LinkedIn, 6 times more likely to convert. So really start thinking about what your strategy is, but not just your strategy and posting, and really thinking about that. What's your unique voice? How do you actually portray that and communicate that to your audience? And what are some of the things that you want them to connect with them emotionally so that they can say, that is the team for me. I really need to make sure that it's a differentiator and not just showing up with all your competition that are saying some of the similar things that come in as well. So that's another one that we have. I know we're coming up on time, but I also want to show you this. When I say geek out, when I'm working with teams, we start to actually get into algorithms. So this is a great piece. If you take anything away from our conversation today, you actually start to go out and post and say, Brian, I want to have my unique voice shared out there so I can attract centers of influence, business owners, all those plan people that come out there and are in control of that, the gatekeepers. Here's when you can publish, and here's what you should publish. So this shows you, as I put this together, the things that you would go out to get the greatest reach and the time of day when you post. So when I'm working with teams, we start to say, let's be strategic about it, not just do something for the sake of doing it. So you'll have all this information. It'll give you a roadmap. So if you start to build out your digital presence, you can take that into consideration as well. What I'll do, we've got investor education in here. We've got networking events. We have all the tools for you. I'm going to flip ahead since we're running out of time here and just get into the action section. So real quick, any team I'm working with, we talked about the research and really thinking about, hey, the strategic business plan is so essential. I call it the foundational pillar. You need to really spend some time in there and make sure that you've got that crafted so that it can be quantifiable. That's where we can pivot and make sure that we can make adjustments when needed as we grow. And there is no finish line in this industry. We should continually be growing. So how do you put in place things that you do to make sure you're implementing and tracking your success consistently? This is where you can have a coach or a consultant, people that you have there, even on your team, that can come in and help you out with that. So really thinking about, when I showed you those focus areas, choosing 2 or 3 of those. That might be centers of influence and referral. What are you committing to? What are the things that you want to use as your language? What is your unique voice that you want to get out there? It makes such a big difference. I talk about it just from advisors' perspective. When I'm working with teams, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are 330,000 investment professionals registered in the US alone. That's huge. So how do you separate yourself? And that's where this comes to be a differentiator, and think about how you pivot, how you adjust, how you make sure you're going to hit those goals. And here's what we give you as well, a framework. So we think about the strategic plan, we think about those focus areas, but then think about those quantitative and qualitative goals. That's where a coach consultant could come in and help you. That's where you can really gain curiosity about your own progress as well. So as you start to think about it, it's not just good enough to put together a plan in January and then we don't look at it again until November because things got busy. It's crafting the time and having these monthly meetings at a minimum, if not weekly, where we come back and really get curious about tracking our progress, getting curious about what we can do differently, where we're seeing success, where we should be spending our time. And once again, we've built that all out for you. So if there's any value that you want at all, let us know and we can make sure those are sent. And I believe we're making sure that Joe has those in his hand also. So that was the last piece there. Once again, this is usually about an hour, hour and a half. So I did summarize some of the things that go in. A couple things though, I hope you saw from your peers when you start thinking about, hey, the impact it has for making sure that I have a business plan, the mindset that you approach with, all those things that come into that, but then also not only identifying your ideal client, getting curious about what actually is in your book of business. Who are you attracting? Who do you mean to attract? What needs to change and how would you do that? Those are all things that come into it when we start talking about modern prospecting, helping teams and financial consultants grow as well. So Joe, if you're there, I'll go ahead and stop. I know I went over. I can get passionate, I can geek out about this stuff with teams all day long. So I'll go ahead and pause. I don't know if we want to take a few questions if anything came in, but I really appreciate the time being with the team just to summarize and go over some of what we create here with modern prospecting to support teams.
Brian, thank you very much. This was a great session and obviously a very important topic for a lot of the folks that are on the call with us today. So we're going to open up the floor for a few minutes of questions. So if you do have something that you would like to run by us, please enter it into the question panel below. I do have a couple of questions that I want to pose to Brian coming out of the session that we just went through today. So one of the statistics that struck me, Brian, was you mentioned that 30% of advisors have a clear plan for growth, while 84 of the fastest growing firms have that clear plan for growth. So obviously, you know, putting that plan in place is so very important, but yet so few actually do it. Do you have any insight in terms of what might hold back an advisor or a firm from creating that plan for growth? Is it the time that you have to dedicate to it, or are there other factors that you know doesn't correspond to more firms putting in these more strategic plans?
Oh, it's such a great question, Joe. I appreciate that. So you can see a smile come on my face. I think doing this for the last 10 years or so, I've gotten curious with teams about why they wouldn't do that as well. And there's a couple big reasons that stick out. Number one, time commitment. Brian, I don't have the time to be kind of going through here. I've got reaction things going on day to day. That's where I get back to that book of business. Hey, we might have clarified our ideal client, but our majority of our book of business doesn't look like that. So now all of a sudden I've gotten to this busy rhythm where it's more transactional than being proactive. So as we start to think about it and we sit down and we actually say like, hey, if we can just take 30 minutes a month to commit to reviewing our business plan, would you commit to that? Yeah, I can do 30 minutes a month with an agenda. So as I said, we have that built out. Another resource I'll give you, a great one, book called Traction from Gino Wickman. If anybody's on here that have seen that, they have the entrepreneurial operating system. There's some great things in there. But once these teams start to see, oh my gosh, I can just meet for 30 minutes. Yes, it doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to be overwhelming. The agenda that we develop is a one-pager. It has 4 steps. So once they see that it's not going to be an hour, hour and a half commitment of going forward every single month or every single week, now they can visualize that, yes, this will impact my success. In addition, when we start thinking about it, how are you spending your time? So I would ask everybody on the call here, that's one of the first things I ask a team, just quantify for me, how much time do you need to spend each week in business development to be successful? It throws people for a loop because we haven't sat down and thought about it. So some advisors, some retirement consultants like Brian, hey, if I spent 15 hours a week, that would be great. Some say 5 because they've already built their book of business and they're just trying to accumulate second generation of wealth and other relationships that go into it. There's no wrong answer there. It's just nobody sat down to think through what that would look like. That way, as a coach consultant, I can come back and say, hey, your 15 hours, did you engage in it? Did you not engage in it? And I only got 5 hours in this week. What do you need to let go of? What are the things that are showing up as obstacles? So Joe, to answer your question, there's a lot of things that go into it. I think it's time commitment. It's also I'm so busy in my transactional that I don't maybe see the value in it. That's why I go to the research. This came from your peers saying, oh my gosh, the ones that actually do this see the highest amount of growth. So it's an option. You cannot spend the time, you can spend the time. What I wanted to show you today is those advisors that are seeing that success, they're spending the time, but they're being very focused and very strategic about it so that it doesn't feel overwhelming. Love that
Great,
question.
thanks, Brian. Another question related to our digital presence. Obviously, in today's day and age, almost a mandatory thing that you have some form of digital presence, whether it's social media, LinkedIn, your own website. Your thoughts or what you've seen from the successful advisors, are they doing these their digital presence as a do-it-yourself project, or are they seeking out professionals that know how to construct and put together the proper messaging that needs to go out to their clients or prospective clients?
Yeah, it's a combination of both. I can tell you in my work, I'll sit down with a team and we can actually do that work. I'll actually pull it out of them, right? So I'm very open. So instead of going to a website or LinkedIn page and saying, I'm a financial professional, I've been in the financial industry for 20 years, I do financial plans, we start to say, like, what is the real you? Why do you do what you do? So I'm a big Simon Sinek geek and fan. So if you haven't watched The Golden Circle, go to YouTube. It's like 18 minutes of your time. It's one of the greatest TED Talks that have ever been out there, most viewed, and start talking about your why. And Simon will go through the different way to message. So a different mindset. So there are professionals out there that can support you. There's also coaches, consultants that can support you. But I think getting you curious to think about it from a different perspective. Don't sort of wash in with everybody else. Have your unique voice come out. I have it with younger professionals that come into the industry. Well, Brian, why would they want to do business with me when they've got somebody who's been doing it for 30 years? Oh my gosh, you're coming in with a different perspective. You're coming in with more of a planning mindset. You're coming in with different skill set. You're not just a stock picker. Not there's anything wrong with that, but that's a different skill set. How are you expressing that? How are you communicating that? How are you communicating how you solve problems for those ideal clients that you want to bring in? Those are questions to get curious about. So whether it's a professional, and there are some really good ones out there in terms of marketing that help advisors, or a coach consultant that can help pull it out of you, it goes back to one of the things I showed you in the research. Advisors know what they need to be doing. They just don't act on it all the time. Come out with your creative language. Come out with the things that are unique to you, because then you're going to be more confident about speaking about it, whether it's in a discovery meeting, whether it's with a prospect, a client, or a center of influence that we talked about before.
Well, great. Thanks, Brian. And that looks like it wraps up our questions for today. So we'd like to thank Bryan Powell and Carissa Baker from and our colleagues at Janus Henderson, and thank you all for joining us for this EPIC Insight webinar. As a reminder, we will be sending out a copy of today's presentation as a follow-up. As always, we wish you safety and health as you support your families, colleagues, and clients. Please don't hesitate to contact us if there's anything that EPIC Retirement Plan Services can do to support you and your efforts. We thank you, and we look forward to having you join us for an upcoming edition of EPIC Insight.
Good luck, everybody. It's great to be with you today.